Her name is Nancy Guthrie, and for most people who encounter that name, it arrives wrapped in grief, wrapped in faith, and wrapped in a kind of sorrow so deep it almost defies language. But recently, and this is where things get deeply unsettling, new questions have begun to surface. Strange details, evidence that some say was always there, hiding in plain sight. Details that even those closest to this story cannot fully explain. What exactly is the mystery linked to Nancy Guthrie? Why, after all these years, are people looking again? And what does the strange evidence detail, the one nobody seemed to focus on until now, actually mean? Because here is what most people don't know. The public version of this story and the private version of this story are not entirely the same thing. There are layers that were never fully unpacked, moments that were glossed over, questions that were never properly asked. And when you finally see what was hiding underneath all along, when you understand what the strange evidence actually points to, it will change the way you see this entire story. So don't look away, because this is where the real journey begins. To understand the mystery, you first have to understand the woman. Nancy Guthrie is not a Hollywood celebrity. She is not a pop star or a reality television personality. She is something far more powerful than any of those things. She is a woman who walked through fire and chose, somehow, to keep walking. Nancy Guthrie is one of the most respected Christian authors, speakers, and grief counselors in the modern world. She has written books that have sold hundreds of thousands of copies. She has stood on stages in front of thousands of people and spoken about loss, about faith, about the devastating and beautiful complexity of human suffering. Her name is known in churches, in grief support groups, in hospital chapels, and in the quiet bedrooms of people who are lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering how they are supposed to survive what they are going through. But Nancy Guthrie's story didn't begin in a spotlight. It began in heartbreak. In 1998, Nancy and her husband David Guthrie welcomed a baby girl into the world. Her name was Hope, and almost immediately after Hope arrived, the doctors delivered news that no parent should ever have to receive. Hope had a rare metabolic disorder called Zellweger syndrome, a condition with no cure, no treatment, and a heartbreakingly short life expectancy. Hope lived for 199 days, and when she died, the world should have expected that to be the end of the story. A family shattered, a couple who would quietly retreat from public life to mourn in private. But what happened next changed everything, because Nancy and David made a decision that would baffle some, inspire millions, and ultimately create a story so layered, so emotionally complex, that people are still trying to fully understand it today. And within that story, within the choices made, the books written, the platform built, and the life lived, there is a detail, a strange, persistent, quietly troubling detail that has recently caused new questions to arise. Questions about grief, about truth, about what it actually means to heal in public. Nancy Guthrie did not grow up expecting her life to become a story about survival. She grew up in a world that was, by most outward measures, relatively ordinary. A middle-class American upbringing, a strong religious foundation, a sense that life, if you worked hard and believed deeply, would unfold in a reasonably predictable way. She married David Guthrie with optimism. They built a life together with intention. They already had one son, Matt, and their family felt stable, grounded, full of the quiet everyday happiness that most people spend their whole lives chasing. And then came Hope. And with hope came the unthinkable. Few people truly understand what Zellweger syndrome does to a family. It is not just the medical reality of caring for a profoundly ill child. It is the emotional brutality of loving someone fully, completely, unconditionally, while simultaneously knowing that love will not be enough to save them. Nancy has spoken publicly about those 199 days, about the tenderness of them, the exhaustion, the way every single morning felt like both a gift and a countdown. She has described holding hope and feeling something that she could only call sacred, a word that, for Nancy, carried enormous weight. But she has also described the darkness, the fear, the moments when her faith, which had always been the bedrock of her identity, suddenly felt like it was standing on sand. This is the part of Nancy Guthrie's Story that doesn't always make it into the inspirational highlight reel, because real grief, is not clean. It is not linear. It does not follow the arc that audiences are comfortable with. And Nancy Guthrie, even in her most public moments, has always known that. But what she chose to do next revealed just how complicated the relationship between private grief and public testimony can become. After Hope died, Nancy and David Guthrie did something that stunned many people in their community. They went public, not just quietly, not just with a few close friends or a small church audience. They went fully, deliberately, vulnerably public with their grief. Nancy began writing. She began speaking. She began building what would eventually become one of the most recognized voices in Christian grief ministry in the country. Her first book, Holding On to Hope, published in 2002, became an immediate touchstone for grieving parents everywhere. It was raw. It was theological. It was honest in a way that Christian publishing didn't always make room for. And people responded with extraordinary intensity. Letters poured in, emails, phone calls, stories from parents who had lost children and felt, for the first time, that someone had articulated the unspeakable thing they had been carrying alone. Nancy Guthrie had found her calling inside her catastrophe. But here is where the story deepens. Here is where it gets complicated in ways that require careful attention. Because shortly after Hope died, Nancy and David received medical guidance informing them that any future biological child they had together carried a 1 in 4 chance of being born with the same condition. Most couples in that situation would make the obvious, painful, protective choice. Nancy and David had another child together. His name was Gabriel. And Gabriel, too, was born with Zellweger syndrome. And Gabriel, too, died at 6 months old in 2001. 2 children, the same devastating diagnosis, the same outcome. And in the aftermath of Gabriel's death, Nancy's platform didn't collapse. It expanded. She became, arguably, the most prominent voice on child loss in evangelical Christian America. She launched a grief retreat called Respite Retreat. She hosted podcasts, wrote more books, and traveled the world speaking to bereaved parents. The story of Nancy Guthrie became, in many people's minds, a story of extraordinary faith triumphant over extraordinary suffering. But what happened next, quietly, slowly, in ways that didn't always make the public narrative, began to raise questions that some people found impossible to ignore. This is not a story about scandal in the traditional sense. Nancy Guthrie has not been accused of crimes. She has not been caught in a public scandal. Her integrity, by most accounts, has remained intact across decades of public ministry. But there is a different kind of darkness worth examining here, a darkness that lives at the intersection of public grief and private reality. When you build an entire identity around loss, when your platform, your livelihood, your public purpose is all constructed on the foundation of your suffering, what happens to the parts of you that don't fit that narrative? What happens to the anger? What happens to the doubt? What happens to the days when faith feels like a performance rather than a conviction? People close to the grief ministry world have noted, quietly, carefully, that there is an immense and largely unspoken pressure on figures like Nancy Guthrie to remain perpetually inspiring, to never be seen struggling in ways that contradict the message. And Nancy herself has occasionally hinted at this tension. In interviews, in offhand comments, in the careful wording of certain passages in her books, there are glimpses of a woman who is working very hard to hold something together, not just for herself, but for the thousands of people watching her. That pressure is not a scandal, but it is a burden, and it matters deeply to this story, because it sets the stage for the strange detail, the piece of evidence that recently caused new questions to arise, away from the stage and the books and the retreats. Nancy Guthrie is, by her own description, a deeply private person. She has spoken about her marriage to David with genuine warmth, describing it as the relationship that made it possible for her to survive what she survived. She has talked about their son Matt, who grew up watching his parents navigate unimaginable grief with public grace and private complexity. She has talked about the strange guilt of joy, the way laughing too loudly after loss can feel like betrayal, the way happiness, when it returns, sometimes arrives with shame attached to it. These are the details that make Nancy Guthrie's story feel intensely human, because she is not presenting herself as someone who solved grief. She is presenting herself as someone who is still, always, living inside it. But recently, and this is where the new questions begin to crystallize, people who have followed her work closely noticed something. A shift, a subtle but unmistakable change in tone, in language, in the way she discusses certain elements of her story. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was there. And for people trained to pay attention to the details, it was impossible to unsee. Time changes every person, but it changes grief figures in particularly visible ways, because grief figures are watched. They are held to a standard of continuity that most public personalities are never subjected to. Their audience needs them to remain consistent, needs their story to stay the shape it was when it first provided comfort. Nancy Guthrie is older now. She has had decades to sit with the loss of Hope and Gabriel. She has had decades to examine what she believed when she first wrote those words, and to quietly, privately reckon with whether she still believes them in exactly the same way. This is not weakness. This is humanity. But in the world of grief, ministry, particularly within evangelical Christian spaces, evolution can be mistaken for betrayal. And what observers have begun to notice is that Nancy Guthrie's recent public statements, her recent interviews, her recent framing of her own story contains small but significant departures from the narrative that made her famous. Not retractions, not denials, but something more nuanced, something more honest, perhaps. And when you lay those recent statements beside the original narrative, when you examine the evidence side by side, a question begins to form, a question that is uncomfortable, important, and long overdue. Here's the strange detail that nobody fully addressed. In the original telling of her story, the version that launched her books and her ministry and her career, Nancy Guthrie framed the decision to have Gabriel after Hope's death in a very specific way, a faith-driven way, a way that positioned the decision as a spiritual act, a surrender to God's will, a testimony to trust over fear. But in more recent conversations, the language around that decision has shifted, subtly, carefully, but unmistakably. Where the original story carried the full weight of divine trust, the newer version acknowledges something raw, something closer to human complexity, something that sounds less like complete surrender to faith and more like the desperate, grieving, very human longing of two parents who were not ready to stop hoping. And that difference matters, not because it diminishes Nancy Guthrie. Quite the opposite. It makes her more real, more honest, more profoundly human than the inspirational narrative ever quite allowed. But it raises a question about the gap between the public story and the private truth. It raises a question about what gets left out when grief becomes a platform. It raises a question about the cost of being someone else's source of hope, and whether that cost is ever fully acknowledged. The strange evidence detail is not a crime. It is not a scandal. It is the quiet, persistent, deeply important gap between the version of a story that comforts people and the version of a story that is completely, uncomfortably true. And in that gap lies everything worth understanding about Nancy Guthrie and about all of us who have ever tried to make meaning out of suffering. We want our grief stories to be clean. We want them to have a beginning, a middle, and an end that makes sense. We want the suffering to point toward something. We want the loss to mean something. We want the person who survived to stand in the light and tell us that it was worth it, that faith held, that love won, that the story was always heading somewhere good. Nancy Guthrie gave that story to millions of people, and she gave it at enormous personal cost, because she lived it, because hope was real, because Gabriel was real, because the 199 days and the 6 months and the grief that followed were not metaphors. They were her life, but the most honest and perhaps the most powerful version of Nancy Guthrie's story is not the one where faith triumphs cleanly over suffering. It is the one where a real woman, holding real grief, makes real decisions, some of them driven by faith, some of them driven by longing, some of them driven by the very human refusal to accept that the worst has already happened. That version is messier. It is more complicated. It does not fit as neatly on a book cover or a stage banner. It is the version that tells the truth about what loss actually does to a person, and here is what we should all take from it. The gap between the public story and the private truth is not a failure. It is not a betrayal. It is simply what happens when human beings try to survive the unsurvivable and try, in the surviving, to offer something useful to the world. Nancy Guthrie did that. She took the most devastating thing that ever happened to her, and she turned it outward. She aimed it at other people's pain and tried to light their way. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. And the new questions arising from the strange evidence detail don't diminish her story, they complete it. Because the most inspiring version of any human being is not the version without cracks. It is the version where, even through the cracks, the light still somehow gets through.